So my name's Andy Brown, and thank you very much for inviting me along today. I'll just share my screen with you. Okay, right. Thank you very much for inviting me along. My name's Andy Brown. I'm from Expleo, and I'm going to be talking about why we humans break software projects and what we can do to fix it. I'd like to give a big thank you to Xpanxion, the conference organizers, and also SHR Talent, because what they've done is they said, we know we can't get you out there to Salt Lake City, but what we'll do instead of paying your airfare and your hotel bill is we'll make a donation to Great Ormond Street Hospital Charity, which is a terrific charity which helps sick children from all over the world with very rare diseases. So thank you very much. Right, so I'm going to start off by making some predictions about the future of software. So I'm going to predict what the future of software development is going to be like in about 10 years' time. Now, that's always any area, but particularly in something as fast-moving as software development. So what are my predictions going to be? Well, my first prediction is that 20% of all the large software development projects, the enterprise projects we start, are going to fail before they even finish. Of those that do finish, many are going to be late and they're going to be over budget. Some of those projects, particularly when they become late or over budget, they're going to take some really crazy risks. And some of those risks are not going to pay off. We're going to work in lots of specialisms, but our specialisms won't speak to each other. And so we're going to be working in silos. And when we do deliver software, we're going to deliver it with more technical debt than the clients are happy with. We're going to add in more processes to catch more bugs and improve the quality, but we're going to be surprised that after we've added the processes in, the quality is just the same. And we're going to build up big regression packs, but many of those tests in the pack are going to be low quality tests, and we've got higher quality tests available. So how can I be so confident about making these predictions in 10 years' time? Well, of course, it's because that's what we're doing today. And if we look back 10 years, we'd be doing exactly those same things. And if we look back to the millennium, we'd be doing those same things again. And if we look back as far as 50 years, we would still have all of those problems, except for the bottom two there, because when we were developing software in 71 or so, we didn't realize we actually had to do so much testing and we had to retest it. So we didn't have those bits there. Now, the question is, for myself, is why is it that we've had these problems for 50 years? Because many of those are very major problems. Is it that we've never once tried to address those problems? And of course, the answer is no. There's been many times when people have tried to address them. And if you go to any bookshop and you go to the IT section, you will find many books on all those problems there. So it's not that we haven't tried to solve them. Is it that we've missed something? And my belief is yes, we're missing something at the moment. And there's two things that I believe we're missing. The first is around software itself. And the software problems we have got two parts to them. Typically, they'll have a technical part and they'll have a human part. Now, the kind of people that are attracted into our industry are very technical minded, and they're very excited about technical problems and they love solving them. So when we get a problem like this, we swarm all over the technical part and we solve it, but we leave the human part. So this is the first part of the problem. The second part is that the most important tool that we use in software today, and in fact, for the past 50 years, we don't really understand it. Okay. Now, of course, we always know that if all else fails, read the manual. But unfortunately, there's no manual for this software tool. So what's the most important tool that we use in software? Of course, it's our mind. And our mind is a wonderful thing. And we're able to solve all these problems in software development, or many problems. But it's got some problems of its own. Firstly, it was developed to solve an entirely different set of problems from software development. Our brains were not developed for this. And secondly, it was developed or evolved in an environment which is very different from the modern day. And this is causing some problems. So what was our mind developed for? Well, It's developed to solve lots of problems, but primarily all of them come together into the following. If we're in generation 1, this current generation, we are trying to solve the problem of getting as many copies of our genes into the next generation and getting those genes, those copies of those genes, into the best position to get as many copies of their genes into that next generation there. Now, we may have lots of problems that we're solving, but they all contribute towards this. And so, of course, we can break this down a bit further. So we can break it down into 2 parts, which is firstly, that we need to survive long enough to be able to reproduce. And then secondly, we need to reproduce successfully. So within survival, we've got to do a whole series of things, such as we've got to avoid being eaten by predators. We've got to avoid succumbing to disease or being killed by rivals or enemies. And we've got to avoid starving to death. And we've also got to avoid being killed in terrible accidents. And we've developed thought processes to solve all of these things. But we've also got to balance all of these off against each other. So we've developed thought processes and decision-making mechanisms to do that as well. Now, in successful reproduction, first of all, we've got to attract a mate, which means we've got to provide a potential mate with proof of what they're interested in, which typically is demonstrating a good gene quality. So if we were a peacock, we would do that by demonstrating it with a tail. We also need to provide proof of that we're able to provide resources for bringing up the children. Against that, we also need to select a mate as well, which is largely the converse of that. And we're also into problems around extended parental care there of perhaps 10, 20 years. Problems that we have developed solutions for on that left-hand side there, we've become very good at it. But now in a modern world, what we are doing is we have an entirely different set of problems there around estimation and planning and so on. So how do we solve those problems? What thought processes do we use? Well, of course, we're using exactly the same thought processes. We're just taking them over. And this is what's causing us problems. And it's causing us these problems here. And we'll look at these problems here in a little more detail, and we'll see how thought processes or biases that we are using or developed on that left-hand side are causing these problems. So we'll start off with projects failing or being over budget or late. Now, the primary reason for that is that we get the estimation wrong. Now, one thing about estimation, if the errors in estimation were entirely down to random errors of good luck or bad luck, you would expect to see as many estimates above as under. So you see as many overestimates as underestimates. But that's not what we see at all. What you see is the majority of projects are underestimated to some degree. Very, very few projects are overestimated. Now, this tells you something extremely important. It tells you that whatever errors you are seeing in estimation are not down to random noise, they're actually down to some kind of systematic bias. Now, as soon as you use the words systematic and bias, all the psychologists jump up and down, get excited, and talk about cognitive biases. And this is exactly what is happening here with our estimations. We've got biases present such as, and these are the 4 principal ones that are causing us to underestimate projects. So it's anchoring and adjustment, overconfidence effect, a show of hypothesis, and optimism bias. All of these are independent biases, but they all work in the same direction on estimation and cause us to underestimate. And all of them have existed, they exist today because in our evolutionary past, they have given us benefits. So we'll look at each of these. So anchoring, this is where you are anchored to an initial value and you do not move far enough away from it. Now, in our evolutionary past, we needed to estimate things for hunting, for trekking, and so on. And typically we would we would recall a similar situation in the past, and then we would adjust upwards or downwards. The trouble is we don't adjust far enough away. Now, this in itself is going to cause a bias, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be in the low direction of underestimation. So then we have to ask, well, why is anchoring going to cause a low estimate, an underestimation? And the answer to this comes from initial value and it comes from the business. Now, the business are controlling pretty well everything. They provide us with the money to do the software development, and they tell us what they want. And also they tell us, well, they're going to tell us what they would like, when they would like it by. Now, you can tell also that if you're in software development and you're that business, typically you want the software as soon as possible and you want to pay as little as possible. So typically when people are doing the estimate, you're going to ask them a question. Can you put this SAP ERP system in by Christmas or by the end of the year? Now, of course, the answer is no. And so you adjust your estimate far enough away, upwards from that. But we don't adjust far enough away. So anchoring alone is going to cause us to underestimate. Another effect is overconfidence. And this is where we're overly confident in our own abilities. Now, overconfidence has its place and it's really good in some ways. And it actually got you Americans to the moon before the Russians. Okay. But it does have some problems. So it causes us when we're estimating projects, we will overestimate our own skill, our ability to influence others that need to do things for us, and our ability to deliver. So we will be overly confident and we will give a low value on the estimate. So how has this benefited us in our evolutionary past? Well, if you recall, we had to attract a mate. Now, typically you will see, if you watch any wildlife film, you will see competitions or fights for mating and resources. Now, there's a problem with fighting. It's very dangerous and costly. You could be injured or killed. So if you watch those wildlife films, typically what you'll see is before the fight starts, the two protagonists, they're going to pace up and down in front of each other. They're going to weigh their chances of winning, and they're going to assess their rival there. And they're going to be trying to convince their rival to back down. Now, you don't need to know much about game theory to work out if you're going to lose the fight, it's better to lose it and give it up by forfeit than risk being injured or killed in a fight. However, if you would win, it's better not to forfeit that fight. So you can see in that initial display of strength and prowess there, you'll be benefit if you are overconfident and you manage that overconfidence causes you to persuade your rival to back down. Meanwhile, your rival is trying to do the same to you. So this actually means that overconfidence is stable in our population. Another contribution is show-off hypothesis, and this is where we engage in unnecessarily risky activities. Now, why would we do that? Well, again, if you recall, we need to attract a mate. Now, one of the things that we need to do in attracting a mate is furnishing proof that we have good genes. So we need to say, look at us, I have good genes, so my DNA is worthy of mixing with yours. Now, how can we do this? Well, if we were a peacock or a peahen there, if we're the peacock there, we do this, we grow this magnificent tail. And so we say to the peahen there, look at my magnificent tail. I have invested vast resources in this. I could only do this if my genes are of superior quality. Choose me. Now, of course, for better or for worse, we do not grow tails. But what we can do is we can engage in risky activities. And by surviving those activities, which other people with lower quality genes would not survive, we are furnishing proof of our superior quality of our genes. You'll see this in modern days where you will see youths, and here I'm particularly talking about male youths. You see this, it's more of a male tradition here, engaging in risky activities such as driving cars fast or recklessly, or driving motorbikes in the same way. In a project, this translates into taking on more risk than is really sensible. So this will drive us to underestimate. And the final one was an optimism bias, which is a belief that we're going to be lucky. Our project's going to be fine. Now, you will see the optimism bias at work with smokers. Most smokers are aware that long-term effects of smoking risk giving them cancer. And most people that smoke for long periods are likely to get cancer, but some people won't. And secretly, most smokers believe they're going to be one of the lucky ones. And like those smokers on our projects, we believe that although many other projects have been hit by adverse events, our project is going to be lucky. So when we estimate the project, we will underestimate. Now, the benefits of optimism bias in our past is it would cause us to overestimate our chances of winning in those competitions. So it will encourage us to participate in an event which we have a low probability of winning, but the payoff is very high. It also helps with self-deception, which helps with increasing our overconfidence there. So projects are late and over budget because we're poor at estimation. And we're poor at estimation because we systematically underestimate them by these biases. Now, once the project is underestimated, at some stage it will become overdue or over budget. When it does, often you will see those projects take crazy risks that projects which are on track do not take. This phenomenon is risk switching, where we will switch our risk appetite from risk adverse to risk seeking. So again, why would we do this? Well, in our evolutionary past, it helped us avoid starving to death. So if you can think of a situation where many species have a variation in their food supply, and if you think of summer and winter, very often there's a lot less food around in winter. Now, when there is lots of food available, it makes no sense to take risks to get additional food. There's no benefit in that. By taking risks, all you're doing is reducing your chances of being killed by predators or other things. However, when there is very little food around, it then makes sense to take risks and take chances to seek it out and to switch from risk adverse to risk seeking. And what's happening on overdue projects is we are triggering this, we're triggering this mechanism. Now, another thing I talked about was working in silos. So we have lots of specialisms, but we don't talk enough. We do this because in our evolutionary past, we have mechanisms to avoid being killed by rivals and enemies. Now, for males, this was a real problem. If you were a male, and anthropologists have looked at this in tribes in Papua New Guinea and other places, if you're a male, you had somewhere between a 10 and 30% chance of being killed in a fight with a rival there, another human. Okay. It was probably the biggest single cause of fatalities in humans, in males, after pathogens. And so your best protection against this was your own group, and they would look after you. So you develop loyalty to your own group, and they develop loyalty to you in order to avoid being killed. And so we do the same today, in the mistaken belief that the marketing team or the finance are going to come along and kill us. And of course, they're not. And the final problem I want to talk about is having too much technical debt. Now, every organization you speak to will complain they have too much technical debt. At the same time they are complaining, they are running a project that is going to add more technical debt to their estate. And they don't see the irony of this. Now, technical debt is not a technical problem. It sounds as if it is, but it isn't. Technical debt here is actually, it's a trade-off between current and future and benefits and costs. It's the classic vice versus virtue dilemma that we find ourselves in. And it's how do we make trade-off decisions? And if you think in our evolutionary past, we had to make these trade-off decisions. We needed a mechanism for making decisions. It needed to be very rapid because sometimes we had to respond to an immediate threat. It needed to be simple. It needed to work with poor quality information and data. It needed to work under lots of different conditions, and it couldn't put a big load on us because we needed to be formulating a response to actually run away from the target there. So we developed a magnificent decision-making mechanism. You will know it as your gut feel. Now, if you speak to a psychologist, they'll say it's the effect heuristic, but actually we know it's our gut feel that's telling us. So all of the most important decisions that you make with your gut feel. So who do you marry? Which university do you go to? Which company do you join? Do you leave them? All of these are typically made with your gut feel. Now, the problem for technical debt, it doesn't touch your emotion, whereas those new features do. So when we make that decision with our emotions, we tend to err on the side of adding in new features. Now, all of the problems that I've talked about, so projects failing late or over budget there, all of these problems are down to or are being driven by human factors. So here, projects over late are being driven by anchoring and overconfidence. We take crazy risks because our ancestors sometimes starved to death. We work in silos to avoid being killed by the finance. We take on too much technical debt because we make decisions with our gut. And as well as these things, we will add in processes to improve quality. It doesn't improve because of an effect known as risk compensation or the Peltzman effect. Our regression packs are full of junk tests because of an effect known as the endowment effect. We end up following a plan that is unraveling and ending up in a go-live disaster. And we continue to fund zombie projects because of the sunk cost effect. Now, all of these problems on the left-hand side have always existed in software development. They've always existed because of these biases and these driving factors, human factors, on the right-hand side. They will continue to exist until we start addressing them. Now, of course, the question is, can we even address these things? Because many of them are subconscious, pre-conscious. And the answer is, other industries are already addressing them. So if you're in the hotel ballroom in Salt Lake City at the moment, if you flew there, you are probably extremely grateful that aviation is a very safe form of transport. In fact, if it wasn't safe, you would have taken the train. The reason aviation is safe is not because airline pilots and so on do not make mistakes. It's because the industry has recognized that they make mistakes and it's worked out processes for avoiding those pilots and so on making mistakes and killing people. Similarly, medicine is also recognizing this and it's putting in processes there to reduce human error. Now, this is probably the book you're most likely to have come across here, Nudge, by Nobel Prize winners Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And it's about how they have applied to improving decisions made in government and public sector. So other industries are indeed making these improvements and addressing human factors. So these are those human factors, and I'll look at just 3 ways that perhaps we can start addressing these here. Late projects, crazy risks, and too much technical debt. So for the late projects, or all of the others actually, we've probably got about 3 tools that we can use. The first is we can train people up. The next is we can use those nudges. The third is we can use incentives, but we need to be very careful with incentives because these so many of these processes are subconscious. If you're not careful and you use incentives, all that you do is you encourage people or motivate people to do the wrong thing, but even more enthusiastically. So how can we do this? Well, if we look at this training, and if we look at how some of the airline pilots or the pilots are trained there to spot hazardous conditions, they would do this partly through questionnaires. And this is the research that I'm working on at the moment. I'm looking at how they train the pilots and making them aware of hazardous attitudes. So here's a typical question from one of those surveys. So you imagine you're flying into an airport, there's a lot of fog, really you should turn around and go home, but you don't. Now, the student pilots then have to answer, and they have to rank in order five answers here. Now, none of the answers are attractive, but that you use forced ranking to force people to make choices. So the first would be, well, you hate to admit you can't finish your plan, or you hate being told what to do by air traffic control, or you're pretty sure things are going to turn out fine. Or maybe you think, well, whatever you do is not going to make any difference, so you might as well just go ahead. Or the fifth answer there would be, you felt you needed to do something quickly, so you just carried on. Now, with these plus other questions, you can then start to spot patterns. And so if people answer this type of question, then you're perhaps indicating that they're vulnerable to having a macho attitude in a dangerous situation. This would indicate anti-authority, which I must hold my hand up. This is me here. This third one would indicate that feelings of invulnerability. Here, you're resigned to whatever's going to happen to you. Or here, you're impulsive. So using this plus other questions, you can actually plot out people's, or these student pilots' vulnerability. And so you can then identify to this person and give feedback that actually this is the risks, or this is what you will be vulnerable to in unexpected situations. And perhaps for this person, a different profile, you will have you'd be vulnerable to feelings of invulnerability. It's not going to happen to you. It starts off with the survey. You then give some feedback. You then feed these the pilots through some scenarios, give them some antidotes, and then you take them through some exercises. And you can raise their awareness and reduce their vulnerability to biases. And this is currently where I'm working. And so with estimation, for example, we've got those 4 biases there, and perhaps we can put together some questionnaires like here. So we're doing a live upload, there's some files missing, we should stop, but actually we carry on. And why do we do that? And then perhaps we've got some questions, some answers here. Perhaps we wanted to finish our plan, or we're confident that actually we can do this, or we're pretty sure nothing's bad's going to happen to us. And we can see that actually, if we answer the types of questions through and we consistently pick these type of questions, we are vulnerable perhaps to the show-off hypothesis, or overconfidence, or optimism bias. And so we can build up a picture for people here, and we can say, perhaps this is the thing that's going to affect you. Okay. Now, this is one way through training, through questionnaires and other areas. Another way to, or an additional way to solve this estimation is to bring in an external observer, someone that is independent and also trained in these biases. Now, they need to be independent because we find it far easier to spot other people's mistakes than our own. So if we don't take part in any active part in the underestimation process, but we merely observe it, we are in a very good position to actually spot the biases that are affecting other people. Now, this was suggested in a recent book here, Noise, by Daniel Kahneman, another Nobel Prize winner. So external observers. A third one is we can use checklists, which are extensively used in aviation. And Atul Gawande has taken them and used them in medicine. And so we can develop a series of questions designed to reveal the biases. So if we were doing questions around underestimation, we could perhaps find out, well, when did the business want the software? And how did they communicate that to you? That's going to indicate anchoring. Or how long did similar projects take? And why have you estimated that or believe that you can deliver it quicker? Perhaps indicating overconfidence or optimism bias. Now, that's how we can perhaps look at solving underestimation. How can we solve projects taking crazy risks? The answer here is actually relatively simple if we've done the bit that we just said. If you stopped underestimation, you should have removed the conditions that are going to cause us to switch our risk appetite from risk adverse to risk seeking. The final one, how do we solve the technical debt problem? Well, if we recall, technical debt is, we have too much technical debt because we're making gut decisions, because we're making it with our emotions, and technical debt does not touch our emotions. So we need a guru, we need someone there that knows the answer. So who could that be? Well, she doesn't actually know the answer, but if we look at what she's holding in her hands, she's holding a cigarette. And a cigarette, or rather the health authorities, actually provide us with a clue to an answer. In our past, our health authorities began to get concerned about the long-term health effects of smoking. And so they decided to force the tobacco manufacturers to put health messages on the cigarette packets. Now, this is all fine, but the problem was these messages were aimed at people's rational system. Now, very few people actually make a rational decision to start smoking. And if you look at what are the potential benefits of smoking when you're about to start, which is typically as a teenager, the biggest one is probably that social acceptance. Cool. And all of these benefits have the following characteristics there. So they're immediate, they're definite, they're concrete, they're emotional, they're enjoyed by us. Whereas the message that the health authorities were putting out was very different. Potential hazards to a future health, a future state of us, which was very different. And so that wasn't touching people's emotions. And so if you look at the message from the health authorities, which was appealing to our logical system, and meanwhile, if you look at on the left-hand side, that was strongly appealing to our emotions. And emotions is always going to win out over logic. Now, things have changed very much, or at least they have in our country. If you want to buy a cigarette packet in our country nowadays, this is what you buy. Okay, all of the images on there are controlled by the health authority. And as well as that logical message there to stop smoking, which is still there, which is appealing to your logical system, the health authorities are putting out some very strong messages aimed at your emotional system. In order to have a cigarette, now you have to put your fingers past that horrible toe, which is a diseased toe from smoking, into the cigarette packet, take out a cigarette and put it in your mouth. And not so many people want to do that. So how does that help us solve the technical debt problem? Well, if you swap out the word smoking for new features and technical debt, this problem largely maps onto technical debt here. So if you want to solve the problem of technical debt within your organization, if you believe that technical debt is too high, and it's not necessarily because there's lots of good things about technical debt, it allows you to do things that you couldn't otherwise do. If you want to reduce your technical debt, you need to shift your message away from logic and into emotion. Now, all of these problems on the left-hand side have existed for 50 or more years in software development, despite many, many attempts to solve them. And they've existed at least in part because of human factors and principally cognitive biases on the right-hand side, which are driving the behavior on the left-hand side. And these problems have existed for 50 years. They will continue to exist. They will exist in 2031 unless we start addressing these problems on the right-hand side. Now, other industries are already doing this, and they've got the tools, and we could have the tools to do this. And I believe the time is long-term software problems. So thank you very much. If you have any further questions about this, please do email me, or if you're interested in taking part in a survey and getting some feedback on yourself on what your vulnerabilities are, please do come back to me, and I'll send you a link to a survey. So thank you very much, everyone.